something quite important for the age farm ecosystem. It's a newly born foundation that has several objectives. One is to give grants, fellowships to students in our programs. This year, thanks to the support of Audi, the car maker, we have been able to give 10 grants to students in our BA program, and to support the participation of many young students in the summer camps that we organize in the summer. Next year we hope to do more and have more support from other funders and provide more fellowships to our students in all programs. The foundation has also other objectives, which is, for example, to spread knowledge on innovation education into the schools, help teachers in the school and university to improve their own teaching approaches, teaching methods, and also to spread knowledge, to disseminate knowledge on important issues and topics with conferences, meetings, events. We've organized a couple of weeks ago the Take It Easy on social innovation. And this year, this evening, we have a conference, which is the first of a series of conferences, in which we invite Italian and international lecturers to talk about issues that are important, important from a political, from an economic viewpoint. And then these lectures are delivered in a very accessible way to all those who are interested, so they're not technical ones, they are meant to address a very broad audience. Tonight, we have the pleasure and honor to have here Benjamin Sutherland, who is, by the way, one of the professors in our BA program. He is teaching geopolitics to our BA students, and his course has been quite successful and interesting, and I hope he will be back with us even next year. He is also a well-known journalist. He writes for The Economist. He has been working for 7 years for Newsweek, so he writes in major magazines worldwide. And he's also professor at HEC. HEC is the major business school in France, and is ranked first among all business schools worldwide this year by Financial Times. So certainly he is one of the top teachers for students working in studying business school in Europe and worldwide. That's why I'm really glad to have you here, Benjamin, and thank you for being with us, and now let me introduce you guys.
Okay, I'm going to see if we can do this without a microphone. If it's hard to hear, just let me know, and we'll use it. Okay, so I've put up, we're starting here with an image, obviously, of Nazi Germany, Imperial Japan, expanding throughout East Asia in the 1930s, Napoleonic campaigns conquering territory throughout much of Europe 2 centuries ago. All of these images represent a certain model for instability or conflict, which I will contrast with a different way in which conflict and instability appears to be organizing itself today. This is an image of a pirate insurgent group known as Movement for the Emancipation of the Niger Delta, active especially in southern Nigeria. So this raises the question, how has the world changed so that these previous images of instability, Napoleonic France, Imperial Japan, even fascist Italy, Nazi Germany. In fact, if we go back through history, we can go back to the Persian Empire, and we see the same essential thing. And that is, throughout much of history, instability has come mostly from strong, organized states. States that have better organization, better control of technology, more centralized power. It is these states that exported instability. Somehow the world has changed, and we see that today, broadly, we have more instability essentially emerging or coming out of weak, less organized states. How can we explain this? Sometimes the biggest shifts in human affairs are the things that we don't even necessarily see or articulate. What I will argue is that globalization is one of the driving forces behind this shift in human affairs. There are plenty of political scientists who have numbers kind of documenting this type of shift. We also see that a lot of instability and wars in the past involved state-on-state conflict. Countries fighting countries, governments and government armies fighting government armies. And that also has changed. We see that a lot more fighting now is involving non-state groups, be it Boko Haram, Islamic State, or other terror groups, the Taliban, for example. What I'll argue is that globalization, which I'll define as essentially, it's the extension of networks, business networks, technology, information, at a time of falling costs for transportation and for falling costs for communications. Those two factors coming together are driving this globalization, which obviously requires a certain amount of a political climate too, because there's plenty of countries, North Korea, Zimbabwe, Russia to a certain extent, Iran, that for various reasons are attempting to limit the extension of these networks and therefore globalization. More on that in a minute. Take a look at just this number right here. The cost of transporting cargo has fallen by about 90% since 1950. It's interesting that it was in the 1950s when the intermodal shipping container was invented. This dramatically reduced the cost of moving goods around the planet. You can see here some interesting numbers on the cost of making telephone calls as recently as 1997. A 3-minute call from the United States to Germany as recently as 97 was more than $3. And to other places in the world it was even more expensive. Now with WhatsApp, the internet, Skype, a lot of other services, calling can be almost essentially free internationally. As this globalization has accelerated, so has the global economy grown dramatically. Now obviously there's parts of the world where it has grown far faster than others, but it's not a coincidence that since 1950, economic growth has risen by about 4% a year globally, whereas for generations before that it was at about 1%. Poverty has also fallen. Sometimes I ask students, if someone walks into a cafe and orders a coffee, pays €2 and leaves, who is better off? The person who has purchased the coffee or the cafe? And the answer is both are better. Both the cafe and the person who's ordering the coffee have gained in the transaction. In fact, that's why the transaction took place. Both actors made equal and opposite calculations. The cafe said, we'd rather have €2 in the cash box and a little less coffee in our stock, and the person who wanted the coffee made the opposite transaction. It therefore follows that societies which for various reasons discourage or limit transactions become poorer, or at least don't develop as much wealth as societies that encourage or have the conditions which allow for more transactions to take place. Now the reasons for blocking those transactions, we'll talk some more about them later this evening, but they can vary. It could be geography makes it difficult. It could be that the government wants to protect incumbents who already have an advantage in business, and in exchange for their support for the government will put up regulatory barriers to prevent other entrepreneurs from providing competition. As this wealth has increased with democracy, or with globalization, so too has the number of democracies. Now there's a number of factors at play here. We'll look at some of them depending on how fast we're able to move forward. But it's not a coincidence. There is a link between liberal market economies and the generation of wealth. There are a lot of ways to describe the communist countries of the 20th century. You can refer to them as authoritarian, refer to them as regimes that, in theory, wanted to create an egalitarian communist society. There's a lot of ways to describe them. One that I'll propose for our purposes tonight is essentially the communist regimes, every one of them, wanted to prevent globalization. Every single one of them wanted to limit dramatically the amount of transactions and exchange and information transfer and travel that citizens in those countries could undertake. It's not a coincidence that the two central symbols of the Cold War are both walls, the Berlin Wall and the Iron Curtain. When globalization, or when the communist bloc fell throughout the Soviet Union in 1989 and then 1991, globalization was given a massive shot in the arm, so to speak, accelerating the amounts of transactions that could take place. It was only in 1986 that South Korea liberalized its passport policy, allowing citizens to travel freely internationally. And yet the power of these networks and these exchanges to generate wealth, and with that stability, is so dramatic that South Korea has a wealth on par with Western European countries. North Korea, of course, is a different story, as you can see here in this satellite image, where the country shows up as essentially dark. So how is it that globalization affects these changes? Well, in a few ways. Number one, what globalization does is it changes, it raises the costs dramatically for conflict. If France were to go to war against Germany today, in a lot of ways it would be going to war against itself, as the connections between these countries are so profound. Networks tend to moderate behavior. In fact, sometimes I ask students, who's the most dangerous man in the world? And the answer, of course, is the man who has nothing to lose. That's the most dangerous man in the world. When you start connecting people and institutions through networks, you bring them in as stakeholders in a system in which they have an interest in upholding that system. Now, we'll take a look for the fun of it at just a few countries here in North Africa and the Middle East, and look at how their militaries, their governments, responded to popular protest in recent years. Let's first take a look at Egypt. When protesters started to try and change or bring down the regime of Mubarak, who eventually fell in the beginning of 2011, the army had a choice. The army could have killed enough protesters to end the protest and keep the regime in power. It didn't do that. One of the reasons is that the Egyptian military, for decades, has had strong ties to the United States. It receives money, training, weapons, and expertise, and crucially prestige from its relationship with the U.S. Department of Defense and support from the White House. Had those generals ordered a crackdown of the protesters, they knew that they would probably be cut off from U.S. support, prestige, money, and so forth. And they decided not to do it. Now, there's other reasons, and if we had more time, we could go into them. But for now, we just take that bit of information and let's compare it to the situation in Tunisia. Also a popular protest against the regime of Ben Ali. Tunisia was a lot wealthier than many other countries in North Africa, fairly developed middle class, business community, and there too, the regime and the military did not kill massive numbers of citizens in order to keep the power, keep the regime in place. We can contrast that with Syria and Libya, two regimes which for various reasons were not connected deeply to Western powers, and in both cases those regimes led vicious crackdowns on the population, different outcomes obviously with the NATO efforts to overthrow the Gaddafi regime in 2011. Now, it appears that we've entered this era of grim, never-ending conflict, wars in Afghanistan going on since 2001, by the way, longest war the United States has ever fought, armed movements in certain places in Africa going on for decades, the Lord's Resistance Army in northern Uganda, South Sudan, northeastern Congo, and Central African Republic, killing and mutilating people since the mid-1980s. There's a number of reasons for that. It's interesting that, for one thing, these conflicts that go on like that take place in areas which, for various reasons, geographic, political, religious, cultural, are not connected to the networks of globalization. In those places, joining an armed group can provide a certain amount of upward social mobility. That doesn't happen in places like Europe, where people have other options in life. Another reason those conflicts go on for so long is a lot of those people who are fighting are in it for personal gain, not for a state objective or a national objective, however defined, but for personal gain. This is one reason why the statistics on rape in places like the Congo are so shocking, or pillaging, or when you have peace treaties that are signed, they often fall apart. Because the structural reasons for the fighting and killing haven't been removed. But there's good news too. Even though these conflicts in these areas that for various reasons are disconnected from globalization, they go on for a long time, broadly the number of people getting killed today in conflict has been decreasing. It's been broadly decreasing since the Second World War. Now, looking closely at the numbers, we can see that it's starting to go back up again, especially in the last 6, 7, 8 years. For reasons we probably won't have time to get into tonight. But broadly, the numbers have been coming down. Sometimes dramatically. Well, one of the reasons is, as conflict moves away from state-on-state conflict, we start having non-state groups, it can be harder to kill on people, even if you want to. Now, the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia managed to kill a fifth of the population after taking power in 1975. They remained in power until 1979, when finally Vietnam sent in troops and took apart their regime. Groups like Al-Shabaab in Somalia being a non-state group, even though they're operating in the chaos of kind of a state vacuum, even if they wanted to kill that many people, they would not probably be able logistically to pull it off. Globalization helps explain this decrease in killing because in many respects it's made it less profitable to kill people. Now by profitable I don't mean just money, but let's say that it's harder to get wealth, power, and prestige from killing people today than it used to be in the past. Well, this is a huge shift in human affairs. When did that happen? Well, if a government encourages globalization, the reason is probably that the government wants to raise tax money from the population, which has to work. Those conflicts I mentioned earlier that go on and on endlessly are all taking places in areas that don't have those types of economies. They're all taking place in areas where the government is not able to raise taxes from the people. And in fact, either lets other groups kill and maim in those areas, or in some cases does it itself. So in places where the government is able to raise taxes or makes a change in policy in an attempt to raise taxes from the population, those people are treated better. You have a greater respect for human rights. For the fun of it, let's take a look at the human rights situation in 3 very different countries. In Sweden, human rights are respected. Where does the government get its money? It gets its money from a modern, highly skilled, knowledgeable workforce in which people have to have the freedom to think, travel, innovate, and so forth. Let's look at Saudi Arabia. The government gets its money from oil. The population, therefore, doesn't really matter. And in fact, it's only starting next year that women in Saudi Arabia are going to be able to drive. Cuba. The one success, according to some analysts of the Cuban regime, was to provide a certain amount of health care to the population. And was that because the Cuban regime had a good heart and wanted to help its population be healthy? You might argue that, but I would say it's not a coincidence that for the Cuban government to get money, it needs people who can work in the fields. Farming tobacco, sugarcane, and other crops. Very labor-intensive work, difficult, and there's not a lot of capital for farming equipment to make the job easier. So in all 3 of those countries, the way people are being treated depends dramatically on what type of revenue the government is trying or hoping to raise from the population. Globalization has also reduced the importance of territory in generating wealth. Territory is less important. Territory is a classic example of a zero-sum system, which means you have a set amount of some good, in this case land, and the more land I have, the less land you have, and so forth. Another example of a zero-sum system would be a lottery. If you've got 10 million euros in the jackpot, you can have one person win 10 million, you can have 10 people earn $1 million each, and so forth. It's a zero-sum system. Throughout most of humanity's history, humanity has been in a zero-sum system. The more I have, the less you have, and vice versa. When wealth came from land and control over slaves and labor. What globalization has done is it has helped usher in a different type of system, a positive sum system in which wealth, power, and prestige come through cooperation, business, exchange, technology, social capital, which is essentially people's trust in the institutions of their state. All of those things in that list are products of globalization, essentially. This is why we don't see Western powers fighting wars of conquest anymore. Napoleon said, I can use 25,000 men a month. What he meant was he could enroll another 25,000 men a month in his army for his conquests. If a French president said that today, in the same context, he would be voted out of office. It was a different world, a zero-sum world, in which wealth, power, and prestige was coming more from territorial conquest. And globalization has allowed us to get away from that way of organizing human affairs. Western powers still fight wars, but it's more commonly these days to stabilize an area for business. Now that doesn't mean those wars were justified or unjustified. I'm not getting into that. But if we look at wars such as, I guess I don't have a slide here, but overthrowing the Gaddafi regime, Saddam Hussein's regime, the Taliban, Milosevic in Serbia. In all of these cases, the government was trying essentially to knock, or international forces were trying to knock out a regime that, for various reasons, was attempting to block networks for that regime's own purposes, which did not align with the population. What globalization does, if governments accept it, is it broadly aligns the goals of the government with the goals of the people. And that's what you want, broadly. You want the government to want you to be making money and generating wealth because the government can therefore tax it. In places that for various reasons haven't been affected by globalization, you have a dramatic difference between the interests of the government and the interests of the people. And that ends up creating poverty, human rights abuses, and lots of conflict. Now, these three images represent different motivations for fighting, for killing people. To kill people, or to get a movement going where you're going to kill people, people have to have a reason to do it. And just looking at the 20th century, the last 100, 120 years or so, we can see some big changes. Towards the beginning of that period, one of the big motivations for killing people was various forms of nationalism. As the 20th century moved on, that developed or degenerated into various ideological systems and reasons for killing people, a struggle between fascism, Nazism, communism, socialism, and capitalism. And what we've seen is that since the end of the Cold War, essentially the last quarter century or 25, 30 years or so, a lot of conflict has been essentially motivated by something else. Here I have an image of the Quran, what I would call cultural conflict, broadly defined, so to include not just religion, but all sorts of belief systems, ethnicity, family, and value systems. Now this is interesting and it's relevant for globalization because what globalization essentially does is it brings groups of people into more contact with each other than they had in the past. A few years ago, I was at a party in Santa Barbara. I meet this guy, older gentleman, and he told me that when he was a young man, he rode around Afghanistan on horseback, and he became filthy rich by purchasing Islamic art, and especially tiles, building tiles, decorative Islamic tiles, shipping them off to Christie's in New York. They were put up on auction. He became wealthy and has lived off that for a few decades in Santa Barbara as a wealthy businessman. The world was so different in the 1960s that he could do that and was essentially seen going into these Afghan villages as a curiosity. He was being greeted with traditional Afghan hospitality. I don't think there's anybody here in this room who would be willing to go do that today. What globalization has done is it's brought these worlds that were so distant, as though they were essentially different planets at a certain point in the past, and brought them together, and that has created, in many cases, friction. Now, this is Mark Twain. I like to think that, for me at least, this quote resonates with my experience of life. Essentially, that the more you travel and go out and get to know other people and live with them, the broader and more charitable your views of humankind and other people are. And I believe that. However, there's a difference between you going out towards another people, wanting to get to know them and travel and live there for a while and then return home. There's a difference between that and essentially an entire culture feeling like it is being subjected to a whole different way of doing things that people in that culture are not necessarily going to like. So to contrast this quote from Mark Twain, here's a line from Samuel Huntington, the late Harvard professor who wrote Clash of Civilizations and the Remaking of the World Order. He says essentially that interaction reinforces existing identities and creates confrontation, reaction, essentially a certain resistance to them. Here you see conflicts being essentially categorized as either being political or ethnic. Of course, a lot of conflicts have elements of politics and elements of ethnicity in them, so the dividing line between these conflicts is not always very clear. Nevertheless, it is interesting to see that the number of conflicts defined as purely political has been decreasing in this age of globalization, with more quote-unquote cultural conflicts, religion, ethnicity, and so forth, taking place. Now this goes hand in hand with these weak and failing states where conflict has been shifting away from the stronger, more organized states, which, as I started the lecture with, kind of were the previous model for conflict. The more a conflict is cultural, the more difficult it is to negotiate. If a conflict involves people's belief in right and wrong, in good and bad, it's very difficult to negotiate. If a conflict involves something like land reform or taxes, it's a little bit different. Maybe there can be some sort of compromise worked out. It's a very different dynamic. This is one reason why the conflict that began in 2001 in Afghanistan, with US-led NATO forces overthrowing the Taliban, has spread into what's now called AFPAC, the Afghanistan-Pakistan theater. The Pashtun people straddles both countries. The conflict being cultural, as much as or more so than political, has therefore flowed throughout that space. Now let's contrast that with another conflict or potential conflict, this time in South America. The late Hugo Chavez, who died of cancer in 2013, supported the far Marxist drug-running guerrillas in Colombia fighting against the Colombian people and the Colombian government. Now, his reasons for supporting the FARC guerrillas were essentially a political calculation, which we won't spend time getting into now, but what's interesting is that because there was not really a cultural animosity between the Venezuelan people and the Colombian people. His efforts to build support for fighting Colombia never took off in Venezuela. That cultural element, which we see existing here and in many other conflicts, wasn't in place. And therefore, he never managed to get the traction for support for that war. Now, the problem of, or the relevance of this kind of shift towards conflict becoming more cultural has a lot to do with what I call fictitious states. There's a lot of states that are fictitious, and by that I don't mean the state is like Kurdistan, which isn't recognized internationally by the state. I'm not referring to that, or perhaps Palestine. I'm not referring to that. I'm referring to states where the peoples, plural, that make up the population living in that area, they never fought together to create the country. They were brought together by an outside power or powers through colonialism in many cases. And because they didn't fight together to create the state, you don't have a strong feeling of cooperation, belonging, or unity in that country. I'm not wanting to say that nationalism is good, but there can be a form of civic nationalism or patriotism which allows people to work together in a nation and broadly cooperate. In places where you don't have that, you have these different groups with different histories. They've never cooperated to build the country themselves. And in these places, the identities being promoted or accentuated through the networks of globalization can become more problematic. Just take a look here. Even the major difference in populations between Muslims and Christian animist societies, which is the white part of this map, even that border or that division isn't reflected in the national borders of these countries. In fact, William Easterly of New York University calculates that about 80% of international borders in Africa don't correspond to the human terrain. It's a famous quote from Charles Tilly, an American sociologist, who said that the state makes war, and war makes the state. It is this process of fighting that over generations, or centuries, or decades, creates this feeling of an entity existing, like France, for example. People in France today have very different ideas about the direction that country should take. Most of them agree that France itself should exist. That's not the case in a place like Nigeria or Ivory Coast, which is essentially a fictitious state brought together by outside powers. Now, I like to illustrate one of the repercussions or the consequences of this. Let's take a look at corruption. And let's take a look at corruption in two different types of countries. Corruption or the lack thereof. Place like fictitious states in Africa, or corruption or the lack thereof in the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. Very different, all former colonies, but very different types of colonies. In a place like, in a fictitious state, a colonial power, in order to manage to administrate millions of people, typically allies itself with the dominant ethnic group, providing that ethnic group with certain privileges in exchange for its willingness to help do some of the dirty work in administering the country. In what is today Syria, when the French were governing the area as a protectorate. They allied themselves with the Alawite population, and that's why Assad and his Alawite clan are still in power today. They built on the privileges they had under the French, were able to establish this rule, which they carry forward into the future. In places like that, the government corruption is quote-unquote natural. If you've never cooperated with these other groups of people, you haven't built the country together, and you have certain privileges in government as an administrator, and someone comes to you and needs a permit to build a building or start a business, it's quite natural for a bribe to be requested in that type of an environment. Now let's take a look at a place like the United States, where you have lower levels of cooperation. What was the original relationship? If the relationship in a fictitious state between the government and the people was one of antagonism, wrong. What was the original relationship, historic relationship between the American government and the American people? Who here has seen the DiCaprio film by Inarritu, I think it's called The Revenant? Anybody seen that? Okay. So what was the only safe place in that world? It was the fort. The early relationship between the population in the United States and the government was one of cooperation. People were afraid of being killed by Indians, of dangers on the frontier. Now, I'm not getting into the rights and wrongs of that, obviously. But you can look back and see how these historic relationships between the government and the population can tell you a lot about the types of conflict you will or are not likely to have in a certain area. You've all seen in Western movies the posse, essentially ordinary citizens being recruited by the sheriff to go hunt a criminal. Imagine if here in Italy some cops came in and said, I need 5 of you, get in the car, we got to go catch this guy down the street, I need your help. The relationship of cooperation, for historical reasons in the United States, is so close, that institution survived until recently, essentially. Dominique Moisy, a French political scientist, in his book, Geopolitics of Emotions, says that essentially what's happening is the world is moving into what he calls the century of identity. And that is kind of the central defining issue of our time. And he says the dominant identity emotion in the Western world is fear. The dominant emotion in rising Asia is hope. Things are getting better there than they used to be. And the dominant emotion in much of the Arab and even broader Muslim world is one of humiliation. By circulating images and information about how other people live, globalization is essentially exacerbating or fueling these positions. This leads to what I call identity entrepreneurs. Groups like Al-Qaeda, Boko Haram, who are able to come into an area where there's an identity crisis, propose some sort of a redemptive religious or ideological belief system. And in many cases, they have been quite successful at getting followers and building support for that. And as globalization multiplies the channels through which information flows, it also tends to create greater polarization. I don't think that Donald Trump could have won had the election taken place 30 years ago, where you had fewer TV stations in a pre-internet world. I don't think he could have done it. But when you have a multiplying number of channels of information, information also tends to become more slanted or biased or more specialized. And that can favor more radical worldviews. What we're starting to see in a number of places in the world is that people are self-sorting themselves increasingly to live amongst people with whom they agree politically or with whom they feel some sort of an affinity. To take a dramatic example, let's look at the Shia and Sunni communities, their distribution in Baghdad. And through the crucible of the occupation and the chaos, we see that over time they have sorted themselves increasingly into distinct neighborhoods. This is even happening in the United States. This is a story I did on what's called the American Redoubt, which is essentially a movement of really staunch conservatives, Christians, and Jews moving to Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, and strips of eastern Oregon and Washington states in order to make those states even redder, more conservative, more libertarian, and more Republican, by people who want to get out and get away from more liberal populations in places like Southern California. If we look at the amount of suffering that Germans went through under the Weimar Republic, hyperinflation, basically the period leading up to the rise of Hitler, and we look at the amount of suffering that Russians went through during the kind of the breakdown and the collapse of the Romanov dynasty before the Russian Revolution, some historians say actually the amount of alienation and suffering that people have gone through in Syria and Iraq just in the last decade or so is even greater. Looking at it this way, some of these groups, like Boko Haram or Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb and so forth, are actually a reaction to globalization. They're actually some sort of attempt to build a different worldview, looking for, in this case, say, a religious utopia, building that out of the ashes of this previous system which is breaking down. Every 10 years or so, on average, there's massive flooding in Pakistan. There's a satellite image of some flooding. These problems, of course, are worse in weak states where the government is unable, or in many cases even unwilling, you don't really have time to get into that today, to solve these problems. What this does is it creates an incredible environment for these identity entrepreneurs to come in, propose a different way of thinking or a religious panacea, and gain support. They're able to provide a certain amount of social services in order to get the support. Muslim Brotherhood became powerful in Egypt really after a 1992 earthquake in Cairo, which flattened neighborhoods. The Mubarak government wasn't able to really provide relief for the population. The Muslim Brotherhood did. and was able to build or kind of parlay that support from the population into becoming kind of a quasi or a shadow state, if you will. Now, as these alternative identities develop in these weak states, especially fictitious states, fueled by globalization, a number of these countries are going to rip apart, or their borders are going to change. There were about 150 countries created in the 20th century as empires collapsed. The Ottoman Empire, Soviet Empire, French colonial, Portuguese colonial, all those different empires, Yugoslavia, about 150 states were created. That process hasn't finished. And globalization in some ways facilitates it. Because when a country gets connected to the networks of globalization, inevitably there's a part of the country that's able to do it more efficiently than another part of the country. Maybe they have a geographic advantage, linguistic advantage, cultural advantage. They, for various reasons, have more expertise and are able to produce goods and services that they can sell on the world market. And when that happens, often that part of the country that's more successful will attempt to break away, seek a divorce. This could be northern Belgium. It could be northern Italy, Catalonia in Spain, Santa Cruz Department in Bolivia. All areas where, for one reason or another, that part of the country was able to connect to the networks of globalization. What about China? Is it possible that as globalization accelerates, we could see massive instability in China? Number one, you've got the biggest concentration of wealth is on the coast. Obviously, these are the areas where you have the ports facilitating trading. You also have ethnic differences between the population and Chinese population in the east, and hill tribes, Tibetans, Muslims in the northwest, and other parts of the country. And crucially, you also have a history of massive upheaval between, and differences between the coast and the interior of China. When Mao wanted to raise his army of peasants to overthrow the nationalist government, which he managed to do in 1949, he attempted to get people to follow him in the coastal towns, Shanghai and so forth. No one cared. In order for him to build his peasant army, he had to go into the interior of the country and get peasants. Is it possible that globalization could facilitate a breakup in China itself? We don't have, the idea, of course, tonight is to kind of do a rapid overview, so we don't have time to look at these things more in detail, but in the class, we do that. One of the risks is that as the Chinese government, if it feels that it could be losing control over the population, after all, its legitimacy comes not from voting. Its legitimacy doesn't come from any connection to communist founding fathers. The wealth production system in China is mostly broadly capitalist. The only reason the Chinese Communist Party is in power is because it has presided over economic growth. If there were to be a crisis and tens of millions of Chinese were out of work and protesting in the streets, what might the government do in order to build quick support for the communist regime? My fear is that what they might do, what Vladimir Putin has essentially done in Russia, provoke a nationalist response in the case of Putin by seizing the Crimea, sending fighters into Ukraine and so forth. Well, China could do the same. There's plenty of territorial disputes surrounding China. It would be very easy for the government to provoke a nationalist response that could get out of hand, could possibly lead to war, all as a consequence of these changes taking place under globalization. And when countries come apart with this dynamic, it's typically the parts that are the poorest and most fictitious where the fighting and the killing happens to be the bloodiest. We'll skip some of this just so forward. Okay. The classic Marxist view of capitalism was essentially a zero-sum model. The richer I get, the poorer you get. I'm getting rich at your expense. What we've seen, however, is actually something quite different, especially looking at how Asia has developed since World War II. As Japan got richer, South Korea got richer, Malaysia, Hong Kong, Taiwan, the other countries with which it was trading also got richer together. That has kind of challenged this Marxist notion that wealth is a zero-sum system. What we see is that essentially what globalization is doing is it is breaking up power. It is making it harder to exercise absolute power, harder than it was in the past. There's all sorts of examples we could give of companies like Kodak that got complacent, and in this new globalized world where information is increasingly important, we're able to kind of leapfrog and render some of those players obsolete. Power is fractional. Power is breaking up. It's being redistributed dramatically through globalization. Historically, power has really been religious, based on religion, charisma, military power, bureaucratic power. What globalization is doing is favoring a new type of power, which is essentially informational power. Be it handling through expertise with computers and hacking or startups, all sorts of power dynamics changing through the clever use of information and expertise. When I was 10 years old, I spent 3 days going to school with a friend who lived in another town. Her name was Katie. Katie was one of the cool kids in the class. This was 5th grade. I remember this. So as I was there for 3 days with her, by virtue of being her friend, I was also in the cool kids. And I was always social and outgoing. I spent a lot of time hanging out with the other kids on that first day of school, making friends. Before the day was out, one of Katie's friends came up to me and said, "Hey, you know, don't be talking to those kids. I had been talking to some of the non-cool kids, and in the process of that, apparently kind of breaking down the prestige of the group." To my discredit, as I remember, I kind of said, "Okay," and stuck with the cool kids for my remaining 2 days. The reason I tell this story, which seems kind of silly, is because it can illustrate a central insight of business and globalization. Coming into this classroom from the outside, not knowing anything about the existing power dynamics, I had no interest in upholding those power dynamics. I came in and was relating to people just on a one-to-one relationship. I was ignorant of the existing power dynamics in the classroom. I didn't care. And the business community is a little bit like that. It doesn't mean that the business people have a better heart, but they don't have a financial interest in perpetuating necessarily the old power structures. What that means is that when a business community comes into an area and it's hiring people for a factory, for example, it doesn't have a financial interest in perpetuating the existing power structure. It doesn't make financial sense. This is extremely different than a political situation where I gave the example earlier of a colonial situation. Colonial power comes in, it's looking for allies with the dominant ethnic group that it's going to use to try and keep down the rest of the population. It gives privileges to that ethnic group at everyone else's expense. Globalization, therefore, can provide an amazing opportunity for groups that have suffered oppression, discrimination for centuries, be it ethnic groups, be it women, or whatever. So globalization can empower groups. But at the same time, and I'll wrap it up pretty quick in the next few minutes, at the same time, this disruption causes reactions by the existing power holders. In the case of my story about being in 5th grade, it was one of Katie's friends who came up to me and said, no, don't hang out with those kids. She saw me as a threat to kind of breaking down the barriers between the cool kids and the uncool kids. And people who have certain privileges are going to resist that. Now, these privileges, it doesn't just mean, I'm not just referring to a government elite, it could be a villager in Afghanistan who has total control over his wife, his sister, and his daughter as a male in a patriarchal society. So those groups are going to resist globalization fiercely. And there are plenty of examples that we could give of essentially globalization creating a reaction which led to violence. This is what Dominique Moisy, the French political scientist, calls the dark, tragic face of globalization. Globalization shakes up power structures. People who have something to lose will often resist it. Let's take a look at how globalization affected Iran. 1970s. The Shah of Iran is opening the country up. He wants to have Western investment and expertise in engineering in order to develop the hydrocarbons in Iran. Western money and expertise starts pouring into the country, starts accumulating in cities. When money starts accumulating in the cities, people from the countryside move to the city looking for work. They're bringing very conservative, religious, villager ways of looking at the world. They're coming into the cities, and they are essentially shocked at what they consider to be Western decadence in dress, advertising, media, and so forth. And out of that comes the Islamic Revolution of 1979. Roughly a similar situation in Algeria, developed differently, but at least 80,000 people were killed in the 1990 civil war as pockets of wealth were developing thanks to hydrocarbons in some Algerian cities. And this accentuated a clash between a westernized part of the population and a more conservative part of the population, often from the countryside, that didn't like how society was changing. Milosevic, Yugoslavia, Serbia, he essentially is able to build support for his regime by, in this case, blaming globalization or describing globalization as a threat to the pure Serbian blood and the Serbian nation. The point being, the ways in which conflict is developing and changing under globalization are myriad. Business is at the center of all of them. And the type of businesses you build and set up will play a role in how these conflicts play out, and essentially whether you're going to have peace and stability developing, or whether you're going to have a reaction to this kind of the Western network model, which could lead to violence. In places where an elite will see globalization as a threat, expect violence. This is probably a pretty good place for us to close. And I guess if there's any questions you have, I'd be happy to try and answer them.
Then there is a cocktail to enjoy, so if you have a couple of minutes, 5 minutes for comments and questions. Benjamin here.
Yes.
A question, maybe more a comment.
Okay.
You sort of touched on it when you showed the quote of Mark Twain.
Yes.
And you talk about how some places and cultures will see globalization as a sort of and people coming in and it's almost a threat to their existence.
Yes.
I immediately thought people who elected Trump has exactly the same reaction.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. This is what political scientists sometimes call caboose breaking. So conservative elements of the society feeling that it's moving forward too fast, things are changing too quickly, they've got to put a brake to it and stop it. So that would be helping explain support for Marine Le Pen in France, Trump, Brexit, definitely. Yes?
How do you see the role of countries? For instance,
How do I see what?
the role of countries in a world where globalization tends to render countries irrelevant?
Right.
For instance, within the European Union.
Right. Well, what we're seeing is that that's a huge subject. Well, the first thing is that for globalization and the networks to thrive, you have to have some support from the government, because in places where they are against it, they can dramatically slow it down in all sorts of different ways. Think of, an example would be the regime in Iran. I don't know if you guys follow this, but every once in a while there'll be an Iranian who grew up in the West, who goes back to Iran wanting to start a kind of a business and start kind of connecting with their homeland, maybe where they grew up or where their parents grew up. A certain percentage of those people are tossed into prison. They end up in prison in Tehran. And what's essentially going on is the regime is saying, hey, we're in charge. We're not going to have our elite privileges threatened by the expansion of these networks, and so they're going to resist that. So, and they're managing with some quote-unquote success to do that. So, in places where the government does not want globalization to take place, they can have a certain amount of success. In fact, I'll move to the next slide because it's kind of apropos to this. This is a good example of, this is a quote from Mobutu, who was in power until 1997 in Zaire and the Congo. And he's on the phone with his counterpart in Rwanda. I told there's a rebellion in his country, and he's saying, send me fighters to put down the rebellion. Mobutu was captured by a reporter with Jean Afrique, says, I told you not to build any roads. Building roads never did any good. I've been in power for Zaire for 30 years, and I never built one road. Now they're driving down them to get you. It's a dramatic illustration of an elite seeing networks or anything that can facilitate commerce as a direct threat to their power. So, I guess to kind of come back to your question, the role of the state isn't over yet, and the big factor today, is kind of drawbridge up, or is it going to be trying to favor connections? If it's drawbridge up, essentially what you have is an alliance between the government and usually a business elite that gets privileges, and they support the government, and in turn what the government does is it puts up barriers to entry to prevent other people from getting into business. And making it harder for the incumbents to get knocked out of business. So that's kind of probably pretty relevant also for Italy, as Italy tries to get some economic growth going, and whether the government decides to favor that or favor the existing elite, a lot depends on the outcome.
Hello, sir. It's Mauro. I have been in London, in Untitled, last week. And what do you think the secret agreement on cyclical, the division?
Oh, right, yes, in the Middle East. Well, it's a good, the Sykes-Picot Agreement is a good example of these artificial borders being established, fictitious states being created, essentially populations in the Middle East that are thrown together into a country, but they don't have a history of creating the country or cooperating, fighting together to create it. Well, we're seeing the consequences of that. These people there's massive fighting and instability in the Middle East, and I think things will probably get worse before they get better. I would say, though, I'm not an expert on the Sykes-Picot Agreement, but I would say that the options available, there weren't a lot of good options either. It wouldn't have been easy for someone who understood the situation better or who had a crystal ball to go in and necessarily do it differently. But we see people living together in the same country who don't have a feeling of belonging or cooperation, and it leads to bloodshed and poverty. Yes?
Do you see European population not having fought together for something as one of the difficulties to actually establish a European identity?
Yeah. In fact, Europe was more unified during the Cold War than it is now. Why? Well, you had this existential threat, at least to Western liberal democracy from the Soviets, that pulled the Europeans together. Now with, almost 3 decades without that threat, what we're seeing is the divisions are growing ever stronger in Europe. Yeah, so I think that's still relevant.
Okay.
Okay. Great. Well, thanks, you guys.